I had been hiking for years, but this trip was different. It was not a short-day hike or a casual weekend in the woods. I wanted to test myself, to push my limits farther than before, so I planned a solo trip into a mountain range that stretched across several counties. The trail I chose was long and remote, with sharp ridges and deep valleys, and people often said it was one of the harder routes in that part of the state. That was exactly what I was after. I wanted silence, challenge, and the feeling of being far away from everything. The morning I started, the air was cool and damp. Fog clung to the trees, and the ground still carried the weight of the night's dew. I had my backpack strapped tight against my shoulders, filled with all the essentials: tent, food, water filter, a small stove, extra clothes, first aid, and a headlamp. I had prepared for weeks, making sure every piece of gear was right, because in the back of my mind I knew that on a trail like this, mistakes could be costly. The first stretch was simple. A dirt path led me through thick pine forest. The smell of needles and earth was strong. Birds shifted in the branches above me, unseen but busy, and every so often a squirrel darted across the path. My boots pressed into the soil with a steady rhythm, and the sound of them mixed with my breath. The forest swallowed sound quickly. Even when the wind moved, it was muffled under the weight of branches. That was one of the things I liked most about hiking alone. How different the world sounded without engines, voices, or the constant hum of daily life. After a couple of hours, the ground began to rise. The trail bent upward, climbing the first real slope of the range. I leaned forward, pushing one step at a time, the straps of my backpack digging slightly into my shoulders. Sweat began to form on my neck, running under the collar of my shirt, even though the air was still cool. The forest thinned as I climbed, giving way to stretches of bare rock and stunted trees. I could see farther now, out over the rolling hills that spread to the horizon. The fog was breaking apart, and strips of sunlight pushed down into the valleys. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that was narrow and sharp. On one side, the land dropped steeply into a valley filled with dark trees. On the other, the slope was rocky and broken, leading into another stretch of forest below. The trail itself was only a few feet wide in places. Walking it made me slow my steps and steady my balance. My eyes kept flicking to the sides, even though I told myself not to. It was just instinct, looking down and imagining what it would feel like to lose footing. I tightened my grip on my trekking pole and kept my body centered. I had read about this ridge before I came. Some hikers said it was their favorite part. Others said it was the most nerve-wracking. Being on it myself, I understood both. The views were incredible, but the exposure was real. A wrong step here would not end with a twisted ankle, it would end much worse. I kept moving slowly, focusing on each step. My boots crunched on the gravel surface, and I could hear the faint rattle of loose stones skittering off the edge when I brushed them. The ridge stretched on longer than I expected. Time seemed to move strangely there, because my focus was so intense. At one point, the trail dipped down slightly, passing between two boulders, and then rose again. My legs burned with effort, and I stopped to drink from my water bottle. As I did, I glanced down into the valley on the left side. The trees below looked like a solid blanket of green. From that height, it was impossible to see the ground. The thought of slipping down into it made my stomach tighten. When I continued, the ridge narrowed even more. In one spot, there was only about 2 feet of flat surface to walk on, with steep drops on either side. I planted each step carefully, knees bent, trying to keep my weight steady. The air felt sharper here, thinner somehow, though it was probably just nerves. My breathing was loud in my ears, and sweat stung my eyes. I finally cleared that stretch and reached a slightly wider section where I could rest. I set my pack down and sat on a flat rock. From here, I could see the trail winding ahead, continuing along the spine of the ridge before dipping into a saddle and climbing again. The sun was tilting lower in the sky. I checked my watch. I had time to make it down to a safer spot before nightfall, but not as much as I would have liked. I ate a quick snack and stood again, tightening my straps. My legs felt heavy but steady. I told myself to focus. This was not the place to get careless. As I moved forward again, something shifted. I stepped on a patch of gravel and my boot slid. My trekking pole shot down instinctively, catching against the ground, stopping me from going farther. The sudden movement made my heart slam hard in my chest. I froze, balanced awkwardly for a second, then slowly straightened. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to keep moving. That moment shook me. It was too easy, too quick. One slip and that would have been it. I kept going, but my senses were sharpened now. Every small rock, every uneven patch of dirt, felt like a potential trap. The ridge stretched on for another half-mile before finally widening into a more forgiving slope. When I reached that point, relief washed over me. I descended into a small grove of trees where the ground leveled enough to pitch a tent. I dropped my pack and looked around. The light was dimming quickly now, and the shadows between the trees were deep. This was the only real spot to camp before the trail climbed again, so I didn't hesitate. I set up my tent, boiled some water, and ate a dehydrated meal. My muscles were sore, and my mind replayed the slip on the gravel over and over. I tried to push it away, but it sat there in the back of my head, reminding me how fragile the line was between control and disaster. Night came fast in the trees. The air cooled, and insects buzzed in the dark. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay on my sleeping pad. I could hear the faint rustle of branches outside, the occasional crack of something moving through the undergrowth. I knew it was probably just animals, but being alone in that silence made every noise seem closer, heavier. Sleep came in waves. I would drift for a while, then snap awake at a sound or at the pressure of my own thoughts. At one point, I sat up and checked my headlamp just to be sure it was where I left it. I drank some water and lay back down, forcing myself to breathe slow. When morning came, I was grateful. The sky was pale blue, the air cold enough that my breath fogged in front of me. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving again. The trail climbed steeply out of the grove, winding upward toward the next ridge. My legs protested at first, but once I found a rhythm, the stiffness began to ease. Hours passed in steady motion. The higher I climbed, the more exposed the trail became again. The trees thinned, and the wind picked up. The ridge here was even sharper than the one before. In some places, it was nothing more than a line of rock, slanting slightly to one side. The path was marked, but faint. I had to watch closely to be sure I stayed on it. At one section, I reached a point where the trail crossed a slab of angled rock. The surface was smooth with little to grip. I crouched low, using both hands and my trekking pole to steady myself. My pack shifted on my back, pulling me slightly to the side. I gritted my teeth and pressed forward until I was safely across. The wind was stronger now, pushing at me from the left. I leaned into it, trying to keep my balance. The valley below looked endless, a sweep of green and shadow. The idea of falling into it haunted me, even though I knew I was careful. Fear and caution were tangled tightly together. As the day stretched on, I realized I was moving slower than planned. Every step demanded attention, and that drained energy. By late afternoon, I was only halfway across the ridge. The thought of being caught there after dark was unsettling. I pushed harder, my thighs burning, sweat soaking through my shirt. The trail curved around a rock outcrop, and that was when it happened. I stepped onto a section that looked solid, but a loose stone shifted under my boot. My ankle rolled, and before I could react, my foot slid out. My body lurched sideways, and my pack dragged me down toward the slope. I dropped my trekking pole and slammed both hands against the ground, fingers clawing for grip. My chest hit the dirt, and the edge of the ridge loomed inches from my face. Gravel slid beneath me, rattling down into the void. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I just lay there, pressed against the ground, the weight of my pack pulling me sideways. I forced myself to inch backward, dragging my body away from the edge. My muscles shook, but slowly I managed to roll onto safer ground. I sat there, gasping, staring at the spot where I had almost gone over. My hands were scraped and bleeding, my ankle throbbing from the twist. The reality of it hit me in waves. That was not just a scare. That had been inches from the end. I sat for a long time. I had planned the hike for weeks. I wanted something hard enough to feel like a real challenge, but not impossible to finish alone. I chose a long section of a trail that wound through the mountains in late summer. It was supposed to take me 2 full days if I kept a steady pace. I packed my backpack with food, water, a map, a compass, a tent, and all the basics. I also carried a small first aid kit and a headlamp. I had done a lot of shorter hikes before, but never something this long completely by myself. The first morning was calm. The air was cool when I parked my car near the trailhead and locked it. I stood for a while, listening to the silence of the forest before I started walking. The trees were tall and green, with patches of light slipping through the leaves. The path was narrow and packed down by years of boots. I felt good, strong, and excited. The first few miles passed quickly. My boots pressed into dirt that was still damp from rain the night before. I followed switchbacks that carried me higher up the ridge. The air grew thinner, but I liked the feeling of pushing forward. Birds called from somewhere deep in the trees, and sometimes I heard water trickling down rocks. Everything felt normal, and I didn't sense anything strange. Around midday, the trail grew steeper. I took a short break to eat a sandwich and drink from my water bottle. My shirt was already damp with sweat, and I laid my pack against a rock while I rested. The silence settled over me again, heavier this time. I looked at my map, traced the trail with my finger, and reminded myself how much farther I had to go before setting up camp. When I got moving again, I noticed the path wasn't as clear. Parts of it were covered with fallen leaves, branches, and loose rocks. It wasn't dangerous yet, but I had to pay closer attention to where I stepped. At one point, I thought I saw something move ahead of me, like a shadow cutting across the trail, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing, just trees and the wind shaking the branches. As the sun dropped lower, I started to think about where I would camp for the night. The guide I had read said there was a small clearing near a stream a few more miles ahead. I pushed myself to reach it before dark. My legs were burning, and my shoulders ached from the weight of the backpack, but I kept moving. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky had already begun turning orange and pink. I set my pack down and walked a slow circle around the site. The ground was mostly flat, and the stream was just close enough for water but not too loud. It seemed like a good place. I pitched my tent carefully, staking the corners down into the dirt. After I boiled some water and ate a freeze-dried meal, I sat for a while listening to the forest. At first it was calm, the usual sounds of crickets, frogs, and running water. But then it shifted. I began noticing how quiet it grew between the noises, like everything would stop at once, then start again. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just how the woods worked at night. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I lay awake longer than I wanted to. My headlamp was off, but I could see the thin outline of trees against the night sky through the fabric. Every little sound outside felt closer than it really was. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, water moving. I tried to slow my breathing, but I kept waiting for something heavier, something deliberate. I must have dozed off, because the next time I opened my eyes, the tent was darker and the air colder. My watch said it was after midnight. I had woken because I thought I heard something moving around outside. It wasn't the usual quick sound of a small animal. This was slower, heavier. I held my breath and listened. The noise circled around my tent, then faded into the trees. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for it to come back, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. The ground was damp with dew, and the air was chilly. I didn't see anything strange, no tracks, no disturbed gear, but I couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps I thought I heard. I packed everything up quickly, ate a small breakfast, and got back on the trail. The second day was harder. My muscles were sore, and the trail climbed higher and higher. The path narrowed until I had to walk carefully, watching every step. On one side, the ridge dropped steeply into a valley full of trees. On the other, the mountain rose in sharp rocks. The sun beat down on me, and sweat soaked my shirt. At one point, I stopped to rest and drink water. As I leaned against a boulder, I noticed something in the dirt. A footprint, not mine. It was old enough that the edges were soft, but it was definitely a boot print. Pointed the same way I was going. That wasn't strange on its own, the trail was public, but it made me think again about the noises I heard the night before. Maybe someone else was out here too, walking close to me. As the afternoon wore on, clouds gathered. The sky grew dark, and a storm rolled in. Rain came down hard, soaking my jacket and dripping from my hood. The trail turned muddy, and every step was a struggle. I slipped a few times, catching myself before I went down completely. Thunder rumbled across the mountains, and I felt the air grow heavy with it. I had planned to make it farther before setting up camp again, but the storm forced me to stop earlier. I found a small patch of ground sheltered by trees and set up my tent in the rain. My hands were shaking by the time I got inside, and everything felt damp and cold. I stripped off my wet clothes, put on dry ones, and curled into my sleeping bag. The rain hammered against the tent all night, and I barely slept. Every time I drifted close to sleep, I thought I heard something outside. At one point, I swore I heard the crunch of footsteps again. This time closer, slower, moving around the edge of my tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I lay completely still, gripping my pocket knife inside the sleeping bag. Morning came gray and wet. The storm had passed, but the ground was soaked. I packed my things as quickly as I could and got back on the trail. The map showed I was more than halfway to the end now. I told myself if I pushed hard, I could finish by evening. The trail twisted through denser woods now, darker than before. The air smelled like wet leaves and soil. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. Every time I stopped to drink water or check my map, I listened. Sometimes I thought I heard movement in the distance, faint and careful, but when I turned my head, it was always gone. By late afternoon, I came to a section of the trail that split into two. The map showed the right side was the main trail, the one I needed to follow, but the left side wasn't marked at all. It looked older, less used, but still clear enough to walk. As I stood there, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the mud, fresh footprints. Not mine. They led onto the unmarked trail. I stared at them for a long time. They were sharp, recent, pressed deep from the rain. Whoever made them had gone that way not long ago. I felt torn between curiosity and fear. In the end, I forced myself to stay on the main trail. I wanted nothing to do with whoever was leaving those prints. The last few miles dragged on. The woods grew quieter, almost too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. My nerves were raw, and every sound sent a jolt through me. My water was low, and my stomach growled, but I didn't stop. I just wanted out. When I finally saw the end of the trail, relief washed over me so hard my knees nearly buckled. My car was still there, untouched. I tossed my pack into the back seat and sat behind the wheel, gripping it tight. My hands were trembling. As I drove away, I thought about the sounds, the footprints, the feeling of being followed. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone had been out there. Someone walking the same woods, close enough to circle my tent at night, close enough to leave fresh tracks in the mud. I was lucky nothing worse happened. That hike taught me something I'll never forget. The scariest part of the wilderness isn't the animals, or the storms, or getting lost. It's the people you don't see. The ones who stay just out of sight, close enough to remind you that you're never as alone as you think. I had been hiking for years, mostly on trails near my home, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I enjoyed being alone in nature, pushing myself further each time. That summer, I decided to try something harder. I planned a solo hike through a remote mountain valley in late September, when the weather could swing from warm and bright to cold and dangerous without much warning. I packed my bag carefully, or at least I thought I did. I had my tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water filter, and a map. I also carried a compass, though I was so used to marked trails that I didn't think I would need it much. The map showed a loop that cut through a valley, climbed up into the ridges, and then circled back to the trailhead. It was marked as a strenuous route, but not impossible. I figured it would be challenging but rewarding. The first day started fine. The trail dipped into thick forest, the air damp and cool, smelling of pine needles and wet soil. The ground was soft, scattered with fallen leaves. Sunlight broke through in patches. I walked steadily, enjoying the calm and silence. The trail was marked at first with painted blazes on trees, but the further I went, the fainter the marks became. That didn't worry me much at the time. I had studied the map and felt confident. By late afternoon, I reached a flat clearing near a small stream and set up camp. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, listened to the sound of running water, and went to sleep early. It was colder than I expected, but manageable. The night passed without problems. The second day was when things began to change. The trail climbed sharply, weaving through fallen trees and rocky slopes. The air grew colder, and the sky turned gray. I checked the map more often, but I noticed something that unsettled me. The trail on the ground didn't always match the lines on paper. The valley was wide and uneven, with branches and side paths leading off in different directions. I tried to stay on the main one, but sometimes it split without warning. At one fork, I chose what looked like the more used path, only to find it faded into brush within minutes. I doubled back, annoyed at myself for wasting time. That was when I started to notice how quiet it was. I hadn't seen anyone since leaving the trailhead. No other hikers, no signs of camps, not even distant voices. The only sound was my own footsteps and the occasional bird. By mid-afternoon, I felt uneasy. I checked my compass, and it told me I was heading west when I should have been heading north. I tried to correct, but the ground was rough, covered with fallen logs and thick undergrowth. I pushed through for what felt like an hour, hoping to reconnect with the proper route, but instead I stumbled into a narrow ravine. The walls were steep, the ground muddy. At the bottom ran a small stream, twisting and vanishing into thicker trees. It wasn't on my map. I stood there for a long time, trying to match it with any feature I remembered, but nothing fit. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I climbed out of the ravine and retraced my steps, but the woods looked the same in every direction. There were no clear trail markers, no footprints, nothing but endless trees. I tried to calm myself. I told myself to keep walking north until I hit the ridge. From there, I could reorient, but the terrain fought me. The slopes grew steeper, the ground loose with rocks. My legs ached as I hauled myself upward. The light was fading. When I finally stopped, breathing hard, I realized I wasn't anywhere near a ridge. Instead, I had wandered into thicker forest where the canopy shut out most of the sky. Panic began to creep in. I forced myself to set up camp before dark. I pitched my tent on uneven ground, boiled some water, and ate without tasting the food. The night fell fast. Inside the tent, every sound outside felt louder than it should. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, and now and then I thought I heard movement just beyond the thin nylon walls. I told myself it was just animals. Still, I hardly slept. The third morning, I woke exhausted. My plan was to head uphill again, no matter how hard, until I reached open ground. I packed quickly and set off. The air was cold, my breath visible. I kept the compass in my hand, checking it constantly. For hours, I scrambled over rocks, slid down loose dirt, and clawed through brush. At last, I reached what seemed like a high slope. I expected to see a view of the valley below, but when I pulled myself over the top, all I saw were more trees stretching endlessly. My stomach dropped. I had no idea where I was. The sun was hidden behind clouds, and I could barely judge direction by light. The compass said I was facing north, but the ground didn't match anything on the map. I kept walking anyway. The forest grew darker, thicker, and more confusing. By mid-afternoon, I came across something strange. It was a fire ring, old and scattered, surrounded by stones blackened with soot. Nearby was the collapsed frame of a tarp shelter, torn and weathered. At first, I felt relief. It meant someone had camped here before, but the more I looked, the more uneasy I became. The fire pit was overgrown with weeds, the tarp half buried in leaves. It hadn't been used for years. Whoever had built it had been long gone. I thought about stopping there for the night, but the place felt wrong. abandoned and eerie. I kept moving until dusk forced me to set up my tent again. That night was worse than the last. I woke several times to faint noises. Once it sounded like something brushing against the tent. Another time it was a steady crackling, as if footsteps were moving slowly nearby. I held my breath, clutching my knife, listening hard. Eventually the sound faded, but I never truly relaxed. On the fourth day, I admitted the truth to myself. I was lost. I didn't know how far off the trail I was or which way led back. My food supply was shrinking, and the cold grew sharper each night. My best chance was to follow water. Streams always led somewhere, valleys, rivers, maybe even to a road. I broke camp and began following the nearest stream downhill. It twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing into tight gullies, sometimes spreading into marshy patches. The ground was slippery, the rocks slick. I fell more than once, scraping my hands and knees. As I followed the stream, I noticed more unsettling things. I found a torn backpack wedged between rocks, its fabric faded and shredded. Inside were broken straps and rusted buckles, nothing useful. Later, I saw a boot half buried in mud, cracked and falling apart. I couldn't stop wondering who had left them and what had happened. The stream grew larger, but the valley closed around it. The walls rose higher, the forest pressing closer. The air felt heavy, damp, and colder still. The sense of being trapped deepened with each step. By evening, I was exhausted and shivering. I set up camp on a narrow strip of ground beside the water. That night, I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. At one point, I smelled smoke, faint but sharp, as if from a distant fire. I sat up, heart pounding, sniffing the air. It faded quickly, leaving only damp earth and pine. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it. The fifth day was the hardest. My food was nearly gone. My body felt weak, my legs trembling with each climb. I followed the stream further until it spilled into a swampy area, thick with reeds and stagnant pools. The ground sucked at my boots, and mosquitoes swarmed my face. I slogged through for hours, moving slower and slower. At one point, I thought I saw a shape in the distance, a dark figure standing still among the trees. My heart jumped. I stumbled forward, waving, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing, just shadows and branches. My mind was playing tricks. I pressed on until I found a patch of higher ground and collapsed. My body ached, my throat dry, my head pounding. I forced myself to sip filtered water and eat the last of my food. That night was unbearable. Hunger gnawed at me. My hands shook from cold. I heard distant noises again, faint but deliberate. Snaps, thuds, soft rustles that seemed too steady to be random. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, eyes fixed on the thin fabric of the tent as if something might push through at any moment. Nothing did, but the fear stayed. On the sixth day, I could hardly move. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts clouded. I knew if I didn't find a way out soon, I might not survive. I forced myself to keep following the stream. Around midday, I heard something new, the faint roar of water ahead. My heart raced. I pushed through the brush until I found it. A waterfall spilling over a rocky ledge into a wide pool. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. There was no way down except to climb the slippery rocks beside it. I hesitated, then began the descent. My boots slipped, my hands scraped, but I inched down slowly. At the bottom, I nearly collapsed in relief. From there, the stream widened into a river. I followed it, stumbling along the bank. The forest began to thin. The sky I had been planning that hike for weeks. I wanted to push myself, not just to clear my head, but to really test how far I could go alone. I picked a long trail in the northern mountains that most people didn't bother with. It wasn't some popular route where you saw families, joggers, or couples with dogs. It was a forgotten stretch, hidden off the main road, the kind of trail you had to dig up old maps to even find. That's what appealed to me. I wanted space. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear into the woods for a while, with nothing but my pack, my legs, and the steady beat of my heart carrying me forward. The trail started out as a wide dirt path, overgrown at the edges, the grass folding in over itself like no one had walked it in a long time. I could tell just by the feel of it under my boots that it hadn't seen regular traffic. The ground wasn't compacted the way popular trails are. It felt soft, uneven, like it was slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The trees were dense around it, tall pines mixed with dead, rotting trunks that leaned at odd angles. The air had that heavy, damp smell of moss, wet wood, and leaves that had been sitting too long. I remember adjusting my pack straps and thinking how good it felt to just step into that kind of silence. No cars, no voices, no mechanical noise in the distance. Just the sound of my boots crunching on dirt and the wind whispering through the trees. First, it was peaceful, but the deeper I went, the more that silence seemed to weigh down on me. After about 2 hours, the trail narrowed until it was hardly more than a deer path. I had to push branches out of my face, step over fallen logs, and duck under limbs that hung too low. The sunlight barely broke through in places, leaving the ground dark and spongy. I passed sections where the ground dipped and held stagnant water, little pools covered with a film of green algae and buzzing with mosquitoes. I moved quickly past those, pulling my sleeves down tight, even though the heat was pressing on me. What bothered me wasn't the trail itself. It was the lack of signs that anyone had been there recently. No footprints, no bike tracks, no broken sticks or candy wrappers. Nothing. The place felt abandoned. By midday, I had made it to a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The view was incredible. A carpet of trees stretched out below me, with rolling hills and a river glinting in the distance. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out some water and a snack, and just stared out at it. That should have been the highlight of the day, but something about that valley unsettled me. It looked too untouched, too endless, like once you stepped into it, you'd never find your way back. I shook the thought off and kept going. The trail on the other side of the ridge dropped steeply, switchbacking down through thicker forest. The air grew cooler, and the ground was shaded with layers of pine needles. The further I descended, the quieter it became. I realized at one point that I hadn't heard a single bird for what felt like an hour. No rustling in the brush, no woodpeckers, no distant calls. Just nothing. That kind of silence wasn't natural. I stopped and listened, turning slowly in place. The forest pressed in around me, every tree standing still, every branch motionless. My breath sounded too loud. My heart beat too hard. I adjusted my pack and kept walking, trying to shake the tension. About another mile in, I saw something that made me freeze. There was an old boot sitting on the side of the trail. It was caked with dirt, the leather cracked and peeling, the sole half detached. At first, I thought it must have been left years ago, maybe dropped by some hunter or hiker who never came back for it. But what unsettled me most was that it wasn't buried under leaves or moss. It looked like it had been sitting there recently. I nudged it with my boot. It was stiff but not falling apart. I looked around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement, any hint that someone else was nearby. Nothing. I kept moving, but the image of that boot stayed locked in my mind. The trail kept twisting deeper, darker. It reached a point where the ground was littered with bones. Not human, but animal, deer mostly from the size of them. Antlers, ribs, skulls. Some scattered, some in small piles. Some looked old and bleached, others fresher, with bits of fur still clinging to them. I didn't want to linger, but I couldn't help looking. The strangest part was that there were no signs of predators. No claw marks, no gnawing, no drag trails. Just bones, laid out like something had placed them there. I hurried past, feeling my chest tighten. It was late afternoon by the time I decided I needed to turn back. The trail ahead had narrowed so badly that it looked more like an animal track than anything meant for hikers. My water was running low, and I had the long climb back up to the ridge ahead of me. I checked my map, but it was useless out there. The path I was on didn't even show up. I turned around and started back. That's when I noticed something that chilled me more than anything I'd seen all day. The trail didn't look the same going back. Landmarks I thought I had passed weren't there. Fallen trees looked different. The spacing between the rocks and roots didn't match my memory. It was as if the trail had shifted behind me, folding in on itself. I tried to stay calm and keep moving uphill, but every few minutes I'd stop and realize I didn't recognize anything. The ridge should have been ahead, but it wasn't. I checked my compass, and it said I was still heading the right direction, but the forest just kept stretching on. As the light faded, panic started to set in. I couldn't find the ridge, and now the trees were swallowing the last of the daylight. I pulled out my flashlight and kept moving, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The silence was unbearable. Every snap of a twig under my boot made me flinch. At one point, I caught a whiff of something foul. It was sharp, metallic, and rotten all at once. I followed the smell without meaning to, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I found the clearing. In the middle of it was a fire pit made of rocks, long cold. Around it, there were tarps strung between trees, ripped and weathered. Empty cans, torn clothing, and more boots scattered the ground. It looked like someone had been living out there at some point, but it had all been abandoned. What made me sick to my stomach was the stains. Dark, dried stains on the rocks, on the tarps, on the ground. Some of the bones I'd seen earlier were piled neatly against a tree. Human bones this time. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a broken camping stove. Every instinct in me screamed to get away. I turned and bolted into the trees, my flashlight beam jerking wildly. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, my throat raw, sweat dripping down my face. I forced myself to listen, terrified that I'd hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, only silence. I pushed on through the night, following my compass north, not even sure if it was leading me anywhere safe. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying. I walked in the dark, every sound magnified, every shadow threatening. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but I didn't dare stop. By dawn, I stumbled out onto a logging road. The sight of it nearly brought me to tears. I followed it for miles until I finally reached a ranger station. My clothes were torn, my body scratched and bruised, my face pale from exhaustion. I tried to explain what I had seen, but I couldn't form the words. I just shook my head, drank the water they gave me, and sat in silence. I never told them about the bones, the camp, or the stains. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Maybe they'd send someone to check, maybe they wouldn't. I never went back. I never hiked off-trail again. That forest still lingers in my mind, the silence pressing down, the boot on the ground, the bones scattered like warnings. I learned something out there, that some places are left alone for a reason. And sometimes, if you push too far into the wrong kind of quiet, you don't come back the same. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail I picked wasn't famous, and that was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted to be away from the crowded paths, the families with kids, and the weekend joggers who turned hiking trails into racetracks. I found a less-known route on an old map, something that wound through thick forest, crossed ridges, and climbed into rough ground that very few people bothered with. It was supposed to be a 2-day hike. My plan was simple: start early in the morning, push deep into the forest by afternoon, set up camp overnight, and then loop back down the following day. I packed light but careful. I had my tent, sleeping bag, food, water, small stove, first aid kit, a knife, bear spray, and a headlamp. My backpack felt heavier than I wanted, but I told myself it would feel lighter once I settled into the rhythm of walking. The first morning was crisp, the kind where your breath hangs in the air even though the sun is already rising. I parked my car on the gravel pull-off near the old trail marker. The wood of the sign was faded, almost gray, and the lettering was barely visible. That told me the trail wasn't maintained anymore. It made me excited and nervous at the same time. The forest swallowed me as soon as I stepped off the road. The path was narrow, almost overgrown in spots, with roots weaving across it like traps waiting for a careless step. I moved steadily, pushing branches out of my way, trying to memorize every turn. My phone had no signal already, which I expected, but it meant the map I had folded in my pocket was now my lifeline. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. At first there were birds, the distant rush of water, even the occasional crack of something moving in the underbrush. But after a couple of hours, the noises thinned out. The air felt heavy, still, like the forest was holding its breath. By midday, I was sweating. My shirt clung to my back, and the straps of my pack rubbed against my shoulders. The sun barely broke through the canopy, but the air was humid, almost choking. I stopped on a ridge to eat some jerky and sipped from my water bottle. From there, I could see the terrain ahead. The forest rolled up into another set of hills, thicker, darker, with no clear sign of where the trail wound through. I checked my map, traced the line with my finger, and kept going. The path became rougher. Fallen trees blocked my way in places. At times, the trail disappeared under layers of leaves, forcing me to guess where it picked up again. I slowed down a lot, worried about stepping wrong and twisting an ankle. By late afternoon, I finally came across a small clearing. It was uneven ground, but there was just enough space to pitch my tent. I dropped my pack, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and set up camp. The silence pressed in around me. Normally, I like silence on hikes. It meant peace, a break from city noise. But this felt different. The stillness was too complete. When night fell, it came hard and fast. The forest turned black like someone had poured ink into it. I turned on my headlamp, cooked a small meal on my stove, and ate slowly. My stomach felt tight, like I wasn't really hungry even though I hadn't eaten much all day. Crawling into my tent, I expected to feel relief, but instead I lay awake for hours. Every tiny sound outside made me freeze. A twig snapping, something brushing against leaves. The shuffle of movement that could have been the wind but could also have been something else. I gripped the bear spray in my hand until my fingers ached. Eventually, I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke before sunrise, my body stiff from the hard ground. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up, and started again. The trail climbed higher now. The air grew cooler, but the climb burned my legs and lungs. I stopped often to catch my breath. At one point, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, deeper, and looked recent. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen a single person since starting the hike, and I hadn't expected to. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me. I slowed down, my ears strained for any sound of footsteps or movement. The forest gave me nothing. The prints led me further up, and for a while I debated turning back. But I told myself maybe it was just another hiker, maybe someone camping further ahead. Still, unease gnawed at me. By midday, clouds rolled in. The light dimmed, and the forest grew colder. I followed the prints until they vanished on a rocky stretch where dirt gave way to stone. The path forked in two directions here, and I pulled out my map again, trying to line up landmarks. My gut told me to take the left trail, but the right one seemed more worn. I hesitated too long, and the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking me in minutes. I scrambled for my poncho and covered my pack, but the ground turned slick. Mud pulled at my boots, and water streamed down the slope. I knew I had to find shelter fast. I followed the right fork, slipping and sliding until I found a shallow rock overhang. It wasn't much, but it kept the rain off. I crouched there, shivering, hugging my knees to my chest. The storm dragged on for hours. When it finally eased, the forest looked different. Fog curled through the trees, and the ground was a mess of mud and standing water. I tried to get my bearings, but something felt wrong. I checked my map again, but the lines and marks seemed useless now. I wasn't sure if I'd strayed off course. I pressed forward, telling myself I'd recognize something soon. But the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The trail thinned, then vanished altogether. I pushed through undergrowth, scratched by branches, slipping on wet rocks. Panic crept in, and I tried to shove it down. I needed to stay calm, needed to keep moving. Then I saw it. Another campsite, a small clearing with a fire pit, still ringed with blackened stones. A tent stood there, sagging and empty. The fabric was torn in places. One corner collapsed. Gear was scattered around. An empty water bottle, a sock, a pot half buried in leaves. But no one was there. I froze, staring at the tent. The boot prints. They had led me here. Someone had been camping, and by the look of it, not too long ago. But it was abandoned now. No sign of where the person had gone. I walked closer, my heart hammering. The tent flap hung open, and inside there was a sleeping bag, unzipped and twisted, like someone had left in a hurry. A flashlight lay in the dirt, its batteries dead. The whole place felt wrong, like I was trespassing. I backed out and stood in the clearing, turning in a slow circle. The forest loomed around me, tall and dark, and I realized how deep I had come. Too deep. The rest of the day blurred together. I walked until my legs shook, trying to find the trail again. My throat was raw from thirst, and though I had water left, I rationed it. Hunger gnawed at me, but I ignored it. As the sun dropped, I had no choice but to set up camp again. I picked a spot under thick trees, far from the abandoned tent. My nerves were frayed, every sound around me sharp and threatening. That night was worse than the first. I barely slept, jerking awake at noises. My body ached, my mind felt foggy, and fear clung to me like the damp air. The next morning, I tried to head back the way I came. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find familiar ground. The forest twisted on itself. Every ridge looked the same. Every hollow was just another dip filled with shadow. I was lost. Days blurred. My food ran low. I ate in small bites, stretched it as far as I could. I filled my bottle in streams and prayed the water wouldn't make me sick. My legs were covered in scratches, my boots caked in mud. I thought of the other tent often. Whoever had camped there, what happened to them? Did they get lost the same way I did? Did they ever make it out? The thought sat heavy in my stomach. On the fourth day, I stumbled onto another clearing. My chest lifted with hope, but it sank again fast. It wasn't the road. It wasn't a trail. It was another camp, but this one was worse. The fire pit was fresh. Ash still clung to the stones, damp from rain but recent. A tarp was tied between trees, sagging but intact. A cooking pot still hung over the pit. But again, no people. It was like they had just stepped away and never come back. The fear twisted into something sharper now. I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was moving through the same forest, camping, leaving, disappearing. I didn't know if that made it better or worse. By then, my body was breaking down. My legs shook with every step. My skin burned from bug bites. My lips cracked from thirst. I couldn't think straight anymore. I just moved because stopping meant dying. I don't remember how long it took, but one afternoon I heard something new. The faint sound of rushing water, stronger than a stream. I forced my legs to follow it, crashing through brush until I broke into a river valley. The river was wide. I had always thought of hiking as something calming. It was the one thing that helped me clear my head whenever life became too heavy. I lived for the silence of the woods, the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt, the way the trees swallowed up all the noise of the outside world. I had hiked for years, some trails short and easy, some longer and rougher, but always marked, always known. What happened on this trip changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was in late September, when the days were still warm but the nights turned cold fast. I had a long weekend off work and didn't want to waste it sitting inside. I packed my backpack with the usual gear: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, a headlamp, a water filter, and some extra clothes. I checked my gear twice because I had decided to try something different this time, going solo on a less popular trail I had only read about in an old hiking forum. The trail was supposed to cut through a dense forest in the mountains, leading to a high ridge with views that few people ever got to see. It wasn't an official marked trail anymore. According to what I found, it had been abandoned years ago when a bigger and easier path was built nearby. That idea pulled me in. I liked the thought of being somewhere few people went anymore, somewhere quiet and forgotten. I studied the area on a map, memorized the bends of the creek that ran near it, and marked a rough route in case I lost the old trail. I felt confident enough. I had been on dozens of hikes before, some lasting several days. I thought this would just be another challenge to test myself. The morning I set out was cool and cloudy. I parked my car near a small turnout off the main road, where a faint path disappeared into the trees. There was no sign, no marker, just a gap in the brush that looked like it had once been wider. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, damp and slick, and the smell of wet earth was strong. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and started walking in. The first few miles were easy. The path was faint but still visible, a depression in the ground lined with rocks and roots. Birds called from above, and the sound of running water stayed close by, guiding me. I could tell the trail hadn't been maintained in years. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and thorny bushes clawed at my sleeves. Still, I liked the feeling of moving through a place that time had almost erased. I imagined what it must have been like when people used it regularly, maybe hunters or loggers or just hikers like me. After a couple of hours, the trail grew harder to follow. The forest grew denser, and the ground became uneven. I slowed down, checking the ground carefully with every step. I stopped to eat a quick lunch on a flat rock beside the creek. The water rushed past, cold and fast, carrying leaves and twigs downstream. I filled my bottle, filtered it, and drank deeply. The air smelled clean, sharp, and I felt good. I thought about how nice it would be to reach the ridge and camp up there, to watch the sunset from a place almost no one else bothered to visit anymore. But after I got up and continued, things started to change. The path seemed to vanish in places. I'd follow what looked like a trail, only for it to end in a tangle of ferns or deadfall. Sometimes I'd find it again a few yards away, sometimes not. I pulled out my compass and map, trying to match the terrain to the lines on paper. I told myself not to worry. I had prepared for this. The creek was still nearby, and as long as I kept track of it, I wouldn't be lost. By late afternoon, though, the forest seemed different. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking more of the light. The undergrowth thickened until it felt like I was pushing through walls of green. The air cooled fast, carrying a damp chill that clung to my skin. I realized I hadn't seen the trail in a long time. I had been following animal tracks without thinking, mistaking them for faint paths. When I looked back, the way I came was almost invisible. I felt a ripple of unease but pushed it down. I had plenty of daylight left. I checked the map again and decided to cut toward the ridge directly. The slope was steep but manageable. My boots slipped on loose soil, and I had to grab roots to pull myself higher. The forest pressed tight around me, and the sound of the creek grew fainter until I could only hear my own breath and the scrape of my boots. By the time I reached a small flat area halfway up, the sky had darkened. Clouds hung low, and the air smelled like rain. I knew I wouldn't make the ridge before nightfall. I decided to camp there on that small patch of level ground. I dropped my pack, cleared a space between roots, and set up my tent quickly. My hands shook more than I expected, though it wasn't cold yet. Something about being surrounded by that heavy silence made me feel watched, though I knew it was just nerves. After a simple dinner of noodles and jerky, I sat outside for a while, listening. The forest was too quiet. Usually at night you'd hear crickets, frogs, maybe owls, but here it was mostly still, with only the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I turned in early, sliding into my sleeping bag and pulling it tight around me. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound woke me. The faint crunch of something moving through leaves, the rustle of brush as if pushed aside. My heart raced each time, but when I listened harder, the sounds faded into nothing. I told myself it was just deer. Still, I kept my knife close by, the handle resting against my palm inside the sleeping bag. When dawn finally came, pale and gray, I felt drained. My body was stiff, my eyes heavy, but I forced myself to pack up and keep going. I wanted to reach the ridge and get back on track. The climb grew harder. The slope turned steeper, and loose rocks rolled under my feet. I slipped more than once, catching myself on trees. Sweat soaked my back even though the air was cool. Hours passed, and still the ridge never seemed closer. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and realized I had no idea where the creek was anymore. The silence pressed in again, thicker now, broken only by the occasional distant knock of wood. By afternoon, I was exhausted. My water bottle was almost empty, and I hadn't seen a stream in hours. I forced myself higher, each step heavier than the last. My legs burned, and my pack felt like it weighed double. Then, as I pushed through a cluster of pines, I came into a small clearing and froze. The clearing was ringed with trees, and in the middle stood what looked like the remains of an old shelter. Not a tent, not a cabin, just a rough frame of logs lashed together, half collapsed, covered in moss. Rusted metal scraps lay scattered nearby, maybe from an old stove or tools. Grass grew up through it all, and the place looked abandoned for decades. I stood there staring, my throat dry. I hadn't expected to find any sign of people up here, not this far in. I walked closer, slow, my boots crunching on dead branches. The shelter smelled faintly of rot and rust. Inside, the ground was bare dirt, uneven, with old footprints hardened into the earth like stone. I crouched, touching one. It was human, though weathered. I felt a tightness in my chest. Who had been here? Hunters? Hikers like me who had gotten lost? Why had they built something so rough and left it to rot? The silence seemed heavier in that clearing. I couldn't stand still for long. I backed away and kept climbing, faster now, as if the forest itself was pushing me out. By evening, the sky had darkened again, and I still hadn't reached the ridge. I was thirsty, drained, and starting to feel lightheaded. My legs shook with every step. When I stumbled into another small flat spot, I gave up for the day and set up camp again. I boiled the last of my water, rationed what food I had, and sat staring at the dark trees until my eyes blurred. That night was worse. I lay awake listening to sounds that came closer than before. Soft, steady crunching in the leaves, circling the edges of my camp. A branch snapping, heavier this time. My tent fabric shivered faintly, as if brushed by something passing close. I gripped my knife, sweating, my heartbeat thudding so loud I thought it would give me away. When the noises finally faded, I stayed awake until the first light of morning. My body screamed with exhaustion, but I packed up quickly, driven by a single thought. I had to get out. Forget the ridge, forget the view. I needed water, and I needed to find the creek again. The descent was worse than the climb. The ground slipped under me, sending me sliding down slopes, my hands scraping on rocks. I tried to follow the lay of the land, aiming toward where I thought the creek might be. Hours passed, and the forest closed in even tighter. My throat was dry, my lips cracked. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on trees. Finally, when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I heard it, the faint trickle of water. I staggered toward the sound, crashing through brush until I came out at a narrow stream winding between rocks. Relief nearly knocked me to my knees. I dropped my pack, knelt, and filtered water until I could drink. The cold hit. I had been hiking for years, mostly on weekends when I needed to clear my head. I enjoyed the quiet of the woods, the steady rhythm of walking, and the way the air seemed different away from the city. It always felt like a place where I could breathe easier. That year, I had promised myself to push further into more remote trails. I wanted to challenge myself, test my limits, and see how well I could handle being truly alone. The plan was simple. I would drive out early in the morning to a trail in the northern part of the state, one that wound through forests, followed a river for a stretch, and then climbed into some rocky ridges where there were few people. I had read that it was less traveled than the trails closer to town. That was exactly what I wanted: solitude. I packed my bag carefully the night before. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 2 days, extra layers, a map, compass, headlamp, and plenty of water. I checked my gear 3 times. The morning started calm. The sun rose over the horizon as I drove, the sky turning gold and pink in my rearview mirror. By the time I reached the trailhead, the parking lot was nearly empty. Just one other car sat there, dusty and older, probably belonging to someone who had gone in the day before. The air was cool when I stepped out. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started down the trail. The first few hours were peaceful. The path cut through tall pines that swayed in the light wind. Birds moved through the branches above me. I could hear the faint sound of the river in the distance, even before I reached it. My boots crunched on gravel and dirt, the steady sound grounding me. I felt good, strong, ready. The trail followed the river for several miles. The water was cold and fast, running over smooth stones and broken branches. I stopped more than once to kneel down, splash my face, and let the chill sink into my skin. The forest was quiet except for the river and the rustle of leaves. I didn't see anyone. That was part of the appeal. By afternoon, the trail veered away from the river and began to climb. The terrain shifted, roots jutting out of the dirt, rocks breaking through the surface. My legs burned with the effort, but it felt satisfying. The higher I went, the thinner the trees became. Gaps opened where I could look back down and see the forest stretching for miles. When I stopped for lunch, I sat on a rock overlooking the valley below. The sandwich I ate tasted better than it had any right to, the way food always does outdoors. I drank deeply from my water bottle and studied the map. My plan was to reach a small flat area marked on it just before the ridge. There I would set up camp for the night. It seemed straightforward. The afternoon stretched on. Clouds moved in from the west, gray and heavy, blocking the sun. The air grew damp and cooler. I quickened my pace, not wanting to set up camp in the rain. My legs ached by the time I finally reached the flat spot. It wasn't much, just a break in the slope where the ground leveled out enough to clear some space. Trees stood close on every side, but there was room for my small tent. I set it up quickly, driving stakes into the soil and pulling the rainfly tight. By the time I finished, the first drops were starting to fall. The sound of rain on the nylon roof came steady and soft. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and ate inside the tent. Outside, the forest darkened faster than usual, the storm pulling evening down early. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the rain. It was soothing at first, like white noise. I thought about how far I had come, how far I would go tomorrow, and drifted towards sleep. Sometime later, I woke. The rain had stopped, but the forest was not quiet. I could hear something moving outside. Slow, heavy steps in the wet leaves. I froze, heart thudding. My first thought was deer. They often moved at night, picking their way through campsites in search of food. But the steps sounded deliberate, slower, almost like someone trying not to make noise. I held my breath, listening. The sound came closer, circling the edge of my campsite. Then it stopped. For a long time, I lay there in silence, every muscle tense. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. Morning came gray and damp. My nerves still buzzed from the night before. I stepped outside the tent to find the ground wet and scattered with leaves. Nothing looked disturbed. I tried to shake it off. Probably just an animal. I made oatmeal, packed my gear, and set out again. The trail grew rougher as I climbed higher. The ridge loomed ahead, jagged rocks cutting against the sky. The forest thinned until only patches of trees clung to the slopes. The wind picked up, sharp and cold. My pack felt heavier than the day before. Around midday, I noticed something that set me on edge. Footprints, not mine. They were faint, pressed into the damp soil of the trail. Larger than my boots, the tread different. They headed in the same direction I was going. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I started the hike. The footprints looked fresh, maybe from the day before or even that morning. I told myself they must belong to the person whose car I'd seen at the trailhead. But something about them bothered me. The depth was uneven, as if whoever made them carried something heavy, dragging their weight. I kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. As I climbed higher, the footprints disappeared where the trail crossed rock. The ridge rose above me now, steep and bare in places. I reached it in the late afternoon, lungs burning from the effort. From the top, the view spread out in every direction. Miles of forest, the river a thin line glinting in the distance, mountains layered behind one another. It should have been beautiful. Instead, I felt exposed. There was no flat ground up there, so I descended a little on the other side to find a place to camp. I came across a small clearing, ringed by trees but open to the sky above. Seemed like a good spot. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, and gathered some wood to make a small fire. The flames cracked and snapped, the smoke curling into the darkening air. As night fell, I couldn't shake the unease that had been with me all day. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper. The wind through the branches, the creak of trees shifting, the snap of twigs. My fire burned low, and I sat close to it, staring into the orange glow. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, not animals this time. The weight and rhythm were different. Slow, steady, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. My heart hammered. I couldn't see anything past the circle of light. I gripped the handle of my knife, though I knew it was a small comfort against whatever or whoever was out there. The steps stopped. Silence pressed in. The fire cracked, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I forced myself to sit still, not wanting to make noise, not wanting to reveal fear. After a long time, the sound of retreating steps moved away into the forest. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just beyond the thin wall of the tent, waiting. By dawn, I was exhausted. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, deciding to cut the trip short. 2 days in the woods had felt like enough. The descent was harder than I expected. My legs shook from fatigue, and my pack dug into my shoulders. The trail wound back down through rocks and trees, the forest swallowing me again. The quiet pressed heavy around me. Hours passed. The light began to fade earlier than I wanted. I kept moving, hoping to make it close to the river before dark. That was when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree near the trail had deep cuts in the bark, fresh and jagged, as if someone had hacked at it with a knife or hatchet. The marks were deliberate, not the work of animals. I moved faster, eyes darting around the trees. The forest no longer felt empty, felt like it was holding its breath. As night fell, I was forced to stop. I couldn't risk stumbling off the trail in the dark. I found a spot under a cluster of pines, quickly set up my tent, and crawled inside. I didn't make a fire. I wanted no light to give away my position. The night was worse than the one before. I heard movement again, closer this time. Twigs snapping, branches shifting. Once, I swore I heard breathing outside the tent. I lay frozen, gripping the knife, every nerve on fire. Hours dragged by. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the sky was just beginning to lighten. I stepped outside and froze. In the dirt near my tent were footprints. Fresh. They circled around, stopped just a few feet from where I had slept, then trailed back into the woods. Panic set in. I shoved my gear into my pack, barely caring how it fit, and took off down the trail. My legs moved on instinct, driven by fear. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. The forest blurred around me. By midday, I reached the river. I have always enjoyed hiking. It started as something small, just day trips on short trails close to home, then turned into longer treks on weekends. Over the years, I learned to pack light but smart, to carry extra water, and to read a map when my phone could not get service. Hiking became my way of clearing my head from work and everyday life. One summer, I decided to push myself a little more than usual. Instead of a short out-and-back trail, I chose a long loop that wound through the mountains. It was supposed to take most of the day but still be doable if I started early. The trail description said it was about 20 miles, climbing steeply for the first half before circling back along a ridge and then dropping down into the valley. People called it challenging but worth it for the views. I set out before sunrise. The sky was still pale and gray when I parked at the trailhead. I had a backpack with water, food, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a knife, and a thin jacket rolled up at the bottom. The air was cool, and the forest was quiet. The first few miles were easy. The trail climbed steadily, and I kept a good pace. I could hear birds waking up, and the air smelled like pine and damp dirt. As the sun came up, the forest lit up in patches, with golden light breaking through the trees. After a while, the trail steepened. My legs burned, and sweat dripped down my back. I stopped often to drink and catch my breath. The climb seemed to go on forever, switchback after switchback, until finally I reached an open section with a view of the valley. The car lot was now a small square far below. That gave me some encouragement. By mid-morning, I was high enough that the air was cooler again. I passed overgrown clearings and rocky patches where the trees thinned. The trail narrowed and I had to watch my footing. A couple of times I saw fresh tracks in the dirt, deer or maybe elk. Once I thought I saw a bear print, but I told myself it was just my mind exaggerating. Hours passed and I finally reached the ridge. The view stretched for miles, blue mountains rolling into the horizon. The wind-up there was strong and cold. I stopped to eat, sitting on a flat rock with the trail map spread out in front of me. I checked my progress, trying to judge how far I had come. According to the map, I was just about halfway. The second half of the loop was supposed to be easier, following the ridge before descending. I packed up and kept going, but I noticed the trail here was less clear. Grass grew high in places and fallen branches crossed the path. I walked carefully, marking the trail by memory and faint signs of foot traffic. After a couple of miles, the forest grew thicker again. The ridge narrowed, and cliffs dropped steeply on both sides. At times, I had to press against the rock wall to make sure I didn't slip. The sun was already tilting west, and shadows stretched long. I realized I was moving slower than I had planned. That was when I first started to feel uneasy. The trail ahead looked different from the map. Instead of bending back toward the valley, it seemed to keep climbing higher along the ridge. I stopped, pulled out the map, and tried to match the landmarks, but the trees blocked most of the view. I walked back a short distance, but there were no other clear forks. The only way was forward. I decided to trust the trail. People must have walked this way before, but as I kept going, it became rougher. Roots stuck out like traps, and rocks made the footing uneven. At one point, I slipped and scraped my knee, leaving a dark streak of blood on my pants. I checked my watch. Afternoon was already fading. I told myself not to panic, but I knew I would not finish before dark. My flashlight was small, just meant for emergencies, not for hours of night hiking. The thought of being stuck out here overnight unsettled me. Still, I pressed on. The trail began to descend steeply, which seemed like a good sign. It meant I was heading back toward the valley, but it also meant I had to go slower, planting each step carefully so I would not tumble. The slope was covered with loose gravel, and every step sent small stones rolling. As the sun sank lower, the forest changed. It grew darker, quieter. The wind died, and the air felt heavy. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. That was when I noticed the tracks again. First, just pressed shapes in the dirt. Then clearer ones, wide paw prints with deep claws. They were fresh. My stomach tightened. This time, I could not brush it off. They belonged to a bear. I told myself the bear was probably long gone, that it had passed through earlier. But as I moved, I kept seeing more prints, following the same path I was on. My chest felt tight, and I had to force myself not to start running. The trail twisted through thick trees. The prints were everywhere, sometimes on the same line as mine, sometimes cutting across. The hair on my arms stood on end. When the last light faded, I pulled out my flashlight. Its beam was thin and weak, barely cutting through the dark. I held it tight in my hand and tried to keep my steps quiet. Every sound made me jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I walked for what felt like hours, the beam of light bouncing in front of me. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I had some water left, but I was afraid to stop moving. Then I smelled it, a musky, sharp odor in the air. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. I swung the light back and forth, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The smell grew stronger. I knew what it meant. The bear was near. I forced myself to keep walking, each step slow, steady. The flashlight shook in my hand. My ears strained for every sound. At one point, I thought I heard a low huff behind me, but when I spun around, the beam showed only empty trees. Minutes stretched into forever. The trail dropped lower, and I prayed it would soon reach the valley floor. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I saw a glint of silver through the trees' water. A creek cut across the trail, wide and fast. Relief washed over me, because I knew the creek led back toward the road. But crossing it was another problem. The water was knee-deep and icy. The rocks beneath were slippery. I stepped carefully, gripping my flashlight in one hand, balancing with the other. Midway across, the current nearly knocked me over. My boots filled with water, and I stumbled to the far bank, shivering and soaked. On the other side, the trail widened slightly. I followed it, my wet clothes clinging to me, teeth chattering. The smell of the bear still seemed to hang in the air. Every shadow looked alive. After what felt like another hour, I finally saw something. Faint lights in the distance. My chest filled with hope. It was the road, the trailhead parking lot. I quickened my pace, nearly stumbling with every step. When I broke out of the trees and saw my car, I almost collapsed from relief. I threw my pack into the back seat, slid behind the wheel, and locked the doors. Only then did I let myself breathe. I sat there for a long time, shivering in my wet clothes, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. My knee throbbed, my muscles ached, and my throat was dry, but I was alive. The bear had not gotten me, though I had walked through its territory for miles. Driving away, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see movement on the road behind me. But the forest stayed dark and still. That night, when I finally got home, I realized how close I had come to being trapped out there. Injured, lost, or worse. The fear of those prints in the dirt stayed with me, the smell in the air, the feeling of eyes I could not see. Since then, I still hike, but I plan differently. I carry more light, more food, even a blanket. I never assume the trail will match the map exactly, and I never forget how quickly the woods can turn from beautiful to terrifying. The memory of that day has never faded. It was the day I learned how fragile I really was, how small against the mountain and the animals that lived there. I came back, but I knew I had been lucky. I decided to go hiking alone in early September. The summer heat was fading, but the days were still long, and I thought it would be the perfect time to take on a trail I had been looking at for months. I wanted something quiet, away from crowded paths and tourist spots. I studied maps for days, looking at satellite images, terrain lines, and blogs from other hikers. I finally picked a route in a state forest, not far from the mountains but not exactly popular. It stretched deep into the woods, passed through ridges, and followed an old logging road before narrowing into a single-file trail that climbed to a viewpoint. I packed as carefully as I could. I brought my usual hiking backpack, a lightweight tent just in case, food for 2 days, a water filter, matches, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, compass, paper map, and enough layers for cooler weather at night. I had a first aid kit, bug spray, and a whistle. I thought I was ready. I checked everything twice before leaving. My plan was to hike in, find a good clearing to camp overnight, then continue to the overlook the next morning before heading back. I didn't tell many people my exact route. I just said I was going hiking for the weekend. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours. By the time I pulled over on the gravel shoulder and looked around, I noticed the place looked much more overgrown than I expected. The parking area wasn't official. It was just a widened shoulder with grass pushing through cracks. No other cars were around. The air was humid and smelled of pine. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and looked at the tree line where the trail started. The opening was marked with faded paint on a tree, almost hidden by brush. I hesitated for a moment. It didn't feel like a normal maintained trail, but that was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted solitude. The first stretch was calm. I walked along an old dirt road that had clearly been used by logging trucks decades ago. Grass grew through it, and small saplings leaned in from both sides. The ground was uneven but manageable. After about an hour, the road narrowed and turned into a proper hiking trail. Roots crisscrossed the soil, and fallen leaves crunched under my boots. I checked my map several times to stay aligned. The paper said the trail was around 7 miles one way, with some steep sections toward the end. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. Usually, I'd hear distant traffic, airplanes, or other hikers, but there was nothing. Just the wind moving high branches and the occasional bird. At first, it felt peaceful, but as I pushed deeper, the silence grew heavy. I stopped several times just to listen, almost hoping to hear something break it. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small creek that cut across the trail. The water was shallow and cold, running clear over rocks. I refilled my bottle and filtered it carefully. My legs were tired, but I felt good. I kept moving. The trail climbed uphill from there, and I started sweating under my pack straps. The deeper I went, the more the path seemed forgotten. Bushes crowded in. Some sections were blocked by fallen branches I had to climb over. The paint marks on trees became rare, almost invisible. I started worrying I might miss a turn. The sun dropped lower, sending orange light through the trees. I realized I should find a spot to set up camp before it got too late. I scanned both sides of the trail and finally found a small clearing about 50 feet off the path. The ground was flat enough for my tent, though roots poked through in places. I set up quickly, pushing the stakes into hard soil, unrolling my sleeping pad and bag. I made a small fire ring with rocks and cooked instant noodles over my stove as night settled. The firelight glowed against the trunks, making the forest feel closer than it was. When I lay down inside my tent, the forest was black and still. I thought I'd sleep easily after the long hike, but I didn't. Every little sound woke me, a snapping branch, the shuffle of leaves. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe raccoons, but my nerves wouldn't calm. My tent felt too thin, the walls of nylon separating me from everything outside. I kept my flashlight in my hand, finger resting near the switch, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a light sleep. I woke up around midnight to something strange. Not a sound this time, but silence so deep I noticed it instantly. Even the insects had stopped. My ears rang from the emptiness. I lay there frozen, afraid to move, staring into the black above me. My heart thumped against the sleeping bag. I held my breath and listened. After what felt like forever, I heard movement. Slow, steady movement. Footsteps. They crunched softly through leaves, coming from the direction of the trail. They stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. I gripped my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to reveal myself. The steps started again, circling the edge, as if someone or something was walking around my camp. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. I thought of calling out, but I stopped myself. My mind raced. Was it another hiker? A hunter? Someone living out here? The steps kept moving until they faded into the distance. I lay awake for hours after that, clutching my knife, unable to close my eyes again. When morning came, I unzipped my tent slowly and scanned the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I stepped toward the trail, I froze. There were footprints, not boots like mine, but worn-down sneakers. The tread was faint, but the shape was clear. They led from the trail to the edge of my camp and then away again. My stomach dropped. I packed up fast, skipping breakfast. My hands shook as I stuffed my bag. I told myself I should head back, but another part of me wanted to finish the hike. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I'd wasted the trip. I convinced myself the footprints could have been old, though I knew in my gut they weren't. Against better judgment, I kept moving forward. The trail climbed harder that day. The air grew cooler, the trees thicker. I checked behind me often, half expecting to see someone following. But I saw nothing. Hours passed. I barely ate, too anxious to stop. My legs ached, but I pushed on until I reached a ridge overlooking the forest below. The view was incredible. Rolling hills, endless trees, a distant river cutting through the valley. But I couldn't enjoy it. I kept thinking about the night before. I decided not to camp again. I wanted to turn back and push all the way out before dark. My legs were sore, but I thought I could do it if I hurried. I started back down, moving quicker than before. The forest grew darker as clouds rolled in. The trail that felt confusing on the way up now looked even worse in the dim light. I took wrong turns, had to backtrack, and burned more time than I planned. By evening, I was still far from the start. My feet dragged, and my shoulders ached from the pack. I knew I couldn't make it out before night. Reluctantly, I searched for another clearing. This one was rougher, slanted, full of stones. But I had no choice. I set the tent with trembling hands. The air smelled damp, and the forest felt suffocating. That night was worse. Again, I heard footsteps, this time closer, slower. They circled more than once. I sat upright inside the tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring at the thin fabric walls. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was outside could hear it. At one point, the steps stopped right next to me. I could hear breathing, heavy, uneven breathing. I almost screamed, but I bit down hard on my lip until I tasted blood. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Minutes crawled by. Finally, the steps moved again, fading into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night. At dawn, I tore everything down, barely folding the tent, just shoving it into my pack. I practically ran down the trail, legs burning, lungs aching. The path twisted and split in ways I didn't remember. I got turned around twice, panic rising higher each time. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing but trees. After hours of rushing, stumbling, and checking the map with shaking hands, I finally reached the old logging road again. My throat felt dry even though I kept drinking. I forced myself forward, every muscle screaming, until I saw the faint outline of the road widening near the trailhead. My car was still there, sitting alone on the gravel. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost buckled. I threw my pack inside and slammed the door. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I looked once into the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, thin, still watching. But I didn't stop. I pressed the gas and didn't look back again. I made it home that evening, exhausted, dirty, and drained. I never reported anything. I couldn't even explain what had happened in a way that sounded real. All I knew was that someone had been out there, someone who walked. I had always liked hiking, but until that summer I had never gone on a trip alone. Most of the time I went with friends or with my brother or with small groups. This time I wanted something different. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to push myself a little farther than I normally did. I picked a long loop in the mountains, one that was not as well known as the bigger tourist trails, but still marked on the maps. It was supposed to take 3 days if you moved at a steady pace. I planned to finish it in 2.5, sleeping out 2 nights, then making it back to the trailhead by the afternoon of the 3rd day. I had spent weeks reading maps, checking weather, and gathering gear. I packed light but careful. A small tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra layers, first aid kit, plenty of food and water filters. I thought I was ready. Looking back, I realize now that all the planning in the world can't prepare you for every detail, every risk, especially the things that are not on the map. The first day started fine. The weather was clear and warm. The trail climbed through heavy trees, with patches of rock and open space where the view stretched far across valleys. I kept a steady pace and felt strong. My pack weighed just under 30 pounds. The ground was dry and firm. Birds darted across the trail, and sometimes I saw small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, nothing unusual. By noon, I had covered nearly 10 miles. I ate lunch sitting on a flat boulder, looking down at the wide green of the forest below. I wrote in my notebook just quick lines, times, distances, what I saw. I wanted to keep track. I wanted to look back later and see how I moved through each part. The afternoon stretched longer. The trail grew steeper. My legs burned, but I pushed on. I drank from streams, filtered the water, filled my bottles. Around 5, I found a small clearing not far from the trail, and I set up camp. I boiled noodles, ate slowly, stretched my sore legs. The sun dipped low. The air cooled. I slid into my bag and listened to the sounds around me. The forest was alive but calm. I felt safe. That night, I slept deeply, though I woke once to the sound of something moving near my tent. I held still, listening. It was faint, just rustling. Probably a deer. I told myself not to worry and drifted off again. The second morning was colder. I packed quickly and got back on the trail. The path narrowed as it moved along the side of a ridge. One side was steep up, the other steep down. Rocks and roots cut across the way. I slowed down, careful with each step. I noticed early that the trail signs were fewer. The first day I had seen small markers nailed to trees, painted blazes on trunks, and clear footprints in dirt. Now there were long stretches with nothing. Sometimes the path itself looked faint, almost washed out by rain or overgrowth. I checked my map often, matching bends and creeks, making sure I was still on track. By midday, clouds began to gather. The air grew heavy. I felt the first drops of rain and pulled on my jacket. The trail turned rougher, climbing higher. The rain picked up until it came down steady, turning the dirt slick. My boots gripped, but I slipped once and scraped my hand against rock. Blood welled quick, but I washed it in the rain and wrapped it with tape from my kit. I had planned to reach a flat meadow by evening, but the storm slowed me down. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The path twisted into thick brush. My map showed a small creek crossing, but when I reached it, the water was swollen from the rain, faster than I expected. I looked for a narrow spot and found one where a fallen log lay across. I tested it, then edged over slowly, arms out for balance. My boots slipped once, but I caught myself. My heart hammered when I made it to the other side. I walked another hour, wet and tired. I knew I needed to stop. The meadow was still a mile away, but I did not want to push farther in the rain. I found a patch of ground near some trees and set up my tent quickly. My hands shook from the cold. My jacket was soaked through. I crawled inside and changed into dry layers. The sound of rain on the nylon was loud, steady, endless. I boiled water in the vestibule and ate a hot meal, though I had little appetite. That night, the storm grew stronger. Wind pushed at the walls of my tent. Branches cracked above. I lay awake long, listening, waiting, heart pounding at every sound. Around midnight, I heard something heavy move through the brush nearby. It was slow, steady, crunching over wet leaves. I held my breath. My mind raced through every possibility. A deer, a bear, maybe just branches falling. The sound lingered, then faded into the rain. I stayed awake long after, staring into the dark, unable to calm myself. When I woke in the morning, the storm had passed. The air was cool and sharp. Everything was dripping wet. I packed my gear, heavy now with water. The ground was muddy. I checked my map and compass. I needed to reach the meadow soon and then curve back toward the loop that would lead me down to the trailhead. I hiked for an hour, but something began to feel wrong. The trail grew faint again, more overgrown, as if not many people had come this way. I slowed and checked the map. The creek, the ridge, the bends, they matched, but the trail under my feet looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, I followed it. The path climbed steeply, then cut across a slope. My pack pulled at my shoulders. My legs burned. After another mile, I stopped, breathing hard, and looked around. The trail had thinned into nothing but faint impressions in the dirt, almost invisible. I checked my compass and map again, tracing lines, counting ridges. Doubt crept in. Had I missed a turn? I pushed on, hoping the path would clear. Instead, it grew worse. Brush closed in tight, branches clawed at my arms. I had to shove my way forward. Soon I realized I was not on the trail anymore at all. I had drifted off without noticing. I turned to go back, but the way behind me looked the same as ahead. No clear marks, no footprints, no blazes. The forest pressed in. The air was quiet, too quiet. My chest tightened. I forced myself to breathe slow. I pulled out my compass, set it to the direction the trail was supposed to run, and tried to move that way. Hours passed. My pace slowed to a crawl. I tripped often, scraped my legs on branches, slipped in mud. My water ran low. I stopped by a stream and filtered more. The map in my hands looked useless now. The lines made sense on paper, but not in the thick tangle around me. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long. I knew I had to set camp, but fear pressed heavy on me. I was lost. I told myself not to panic, But panic came anyway, fast and sharp. My hands shook as I pitched the tent. I ate cold food because I was too tired to light the stove. I crawled inside, zipped the door, and lay still. The night was worse than the last. Every sound made me jolt. Rustling, snapping, the distant cry of some animal. I thought of the heavy steps I had heard before. I thought of the storm, the swollen creek, the faint trail. I thought of how nobody knew exactly where I was, only that I was somewhere on the loop. If I could not find my way back, no one would find me easily. The next morning I woke early, stiff and sore. I forced myself to eat, though I felt sick. I studied the map again, tracing the ridges. If I kept moving east, I should cross the loop again at some point. That became my goal. I broke camp and walked. The brush tore at me, but I kept going. I climbed over logs, ducked under branches. My clothes were ripped in places. My boots were caked in mud. Time dragged. The forest seemed endless, every ridge leading only to another ridge. By afternoon, I reached a rocky slope. I climbed it slowly, pulling myself up with my hands. At the top, the trees opened a little, giving me a view. My heart sank. All around stretched nothing but forest, rolling hills and ridges, no trail, no meadow, no sign of people. I sat down hard, exhausted. My chest ached. I drank water, ate a bar, tried to steady my breathing. The fear grew sharper now, heavy in my stomach. I was truly lost. I forced myself to keep moving. Going downhill was easier, so I chose that, hoping to reach a larger stream or river. People always say to follow water. Can lead to roads, towns, anything. I hiked down until I found a small creek. I followed it, moving slow along the bank. The light faded quick. I had to camp again. I pitched the tent on a patch of flat ground, ate a little, then lay in my bag shivering. My body hurt all over. My mind spun with thoughts of rescue, of search parties, of how long I could last with the food I had. I had maybe 3 days left if I rationed. The next morning, I followed the creek farther. It twisted through dense brush, sometimes vanishing underground, then reappearing. I slipped on wet rocks more than once. My ankle twisted but held. I kept moving, slow, limping at times. By midday, I heard a new sound. Rushing water, louder, stronger. I pushed ahead. I had always enjoyed hiking. It wasn't just about exercise for me. It was about leaving everything behind for a while. The noise of the city, the work stress, the constant hum of life. None of that existed when I was out on a trail. Out there, it was just me. The sound of my boots against dirt, the smell of pine or dry grass, and the steady rhythm of breathing. That's all I ever wanted. On a quiet morning in late September, I decided to go for a long solo hike. The air was already turning colder at night, but the days were still warm. It was one of those perfect seasons when the sun didn't burn your skin, but you didn't need heavy layers either. I had been planning to go on this hike for weeks, studying maps, checking routes, and making sure I knew the trail. It was supposed to be a long loop through forested hills, about 18 miles in total. Long enough to be a challenge, but still doable in a single day if I started early. I left home before sunrise with my backpack packed the night before. I carried water, a few energy bars, a sandwich wrapped in foil, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, and a rain jacket. I strapped my phone to the outside of my pack with a power bank, though I didn't expect to get much service out there. I also had a folded map inside a plastic bag, just in case. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour and a half. The sun was coming up when I pulled into the small gravel lot. There were only 2 other cars there, which meant I wouldn't be completely alone on the trail. That made me feel a little better, though I was never afraid of solitude. I locked the car, tightened the straps of my backpack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound through tall pine trees with needles softening the ground. Every step had that muffled crunch of pine and dirt. The air smelled sharp and clean, like sap and soil. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees in slanted golden lines. I moved quickly at first, keeping a steady pace to warm up my muscles. The trail climbed slowly higher into the hills. The trees thinned in places, opening into clearings where I could see distant ridges. The leaves on some of the smaller trees were already turning yellow and red, giving the landscape a patchwork look. I stopped once to drink water and check the map, then kept going. I felt strong, confident, and glad I had chosen this hike. By mid-morning, I had done about 6 miles. That was when things began to feel different. The trail grew narrower and rockier, with fewer signs that other people had been through recently. Fallen branches lay across the path. Some sections were overgrown with tall grass and brambles. It wasn't impassable, but it was clear that fewer hikers came this far. I brushed past the growth, careful not to trip, and kept checking behind me out of habit. That was when I first noticed the silence. Earlier, I had heard birds, insects, even the distant rustling of squirrels or something small in the underbrush. But by the time I reached this section, the forest seemed to have gone still. My own footsteps sounded louder than they should have. When I stopped, the silence pressed around me, heavy and complete. I tried not to think about it. Sometimes animals just move deeper into the woods during the day, and silence can settle in. Still, I felt uneasy, as though the forest itself was watching me. I pushed forward. Hours passed. I stopped for lunch around mile 9, sitting on a flat rock by a dry creek bed. I unwrapped my sandwich, ate slowly, and drank more water. The sun was high overhead, and I could feel the heat of it on the back of my neck. I checked the map again, tracing the line of the loop. According to my plan, I was halfway. If I kept up the same pace, I would finish before dark. I set off again, crossing the dry creek and following the trail as it climbed another ridge. This section was rougher, with steep inclines and loose rocks. My legs began to burn. Sweat soaked through my shirt and dampened the straps of my pack. I stopped several times to catch my breath, leaning on my knees. That was when I noticed something strange. I looked at the ground and realized I hadn't seen any other footprints in a long time. Earlier, near the start of the trail, I had seen clear prints from hiking boots, even paw prints from dogs. But here, the dirt and mud looked undisturbed except for my own tracks. It was as if no one had been this far in weeks. The thought unsettled me. I checked the map again, comparing the bends of the trail with the drawn line. It seemed to match, though I wasn't fully sure anymore. The trail markers were old and faded, some nearly impossible to see. I told myself I was fine, just keep moving forward. By the time I reached mile 12, I was exhausted. My legs felt heavy, and my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. The forest here was darker, the trees denser and closer together. The ground was uneven, roots jutting up in places like bones. I stumbled more than once. My water supply was running lower than I wanted, so I rationed it, taking small sips. Then came the noise. I had just stopped to rest when I heard it. A sharp crack of a branch not far behind me. I froze, listening. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. At first, I thought maybe it was another hiker, but there had been no voices, no footsteps, no sign of anyone else all day. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was still again, silent except for my breathing. I started walking faster. My boots crunched over leaves, my backpack swayed, and every step made me more aware of the noise I was making. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone there, but the trail stayed empty. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Another crack, closer this time. I didn't stop to look. I quickened my pace, nearly jogging down the trail, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, maybe, or some animal moving through the brush. But the sound didn't feel random. It felt timed, like something following me. The trail began to descend steeply, switchbacking down a slope. My legs shook with the effort of keeping balance. I stumbled twice, catching myself on trees. The forest was darker here, shadows stretching long across the path even though the sun was still out. At the bottom of the slope, the trail split. That was the moment my stomach dropped. The map I carried showed no fork here. The loop was supposed to be a single path. Yet right in front of me, the trail split into 2 directions. Both looked worn, both leading deeper into the trees. I stood frozen, sweat dripping down my back, Which way was right? I pulled out the map again, unfolding it with shaking hands. I scanned it over and over, trying to match the landmarks. Nothing made sense. It didn't show a fork. Either I had missed a marker earlier, or the trail had changed since the map was printed. I knew the smart choice was to turn back. I should have retraced my steps until I was certain of where I was. But I didn't. I was tired, frustrated, and convinced that going forward would eventually reconnect with the loop. So I picked the left path. It was a mistake. The trail narrowed quickly, turning rough and uneven. It looked less used than the one I had left. Low branches forced me to duck. Thorns scraped my arms, and spiderwebs clung to my face. The ground sloped downward into a hollow where the air felt cooler and damp. That was when I smelled it. Something foul like rot and wet earth clung to the air, stronger with every step. I covered my mouth with my sleeve, gagging. The smell reminded me of something dead. I didn't want to stay. I hurried on, my nerves fraying. My mind filled with thoughts I tried to push away. What if there was a dead animal nearby? Or worse, what if it wasn't an animal? The noise came again, a branch snapping, closer now. I spun around, my flashlight in hand even though it was still daylight. The beam cut across the trees, lighting up bark, leaves, and undergrowth. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. But I knew I wasn't alone. At that moment, I realized I had lost control of the hike. I wasn't calm anymore. I wasn't making steady progress or enjoying the solitude. I was being watched, followed, and I didn't know by what. I kept moving, faster and faster, until my lungs burned. My legs ached so badly I thought they might give out, but I didn't stop. The trail twisted endlessly, with no sign of reconnecting to the loop. The sun began to drop. Shadows grew long, and the forest turned dim. My watch told me it was late afternoon. I had maybe 2 hours of light left, not enough to get back if I was still on the wrong trail. Panic built in my chest. I had to decide whether to keep going or turn back. Neither choice felt safe. I had been planning the hike for months. The trail wasn't marked on most maps anymore, only mentioned in old hiking forums and passed around as a kind of hidden route. People said it had once been maintained decades ago but had since grown wild, forgotten, and nearly erased by nature. That was exactly what drew me to it. I wanted to experience something that felt raw and away from the regular busy hiking paths. I didn't want to run into crowds or see people in neon jackets stopping for selfies every 100 feet. I wanted solitude, silence, and something that felt like a true escape. The morning I set out was colder than I expected. The air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that stings your nose when you first breathe in. I pulled the straps of my pack tighter, adjusted my boots, and started up the old trail. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and the forest smelled of wet leaves and soil. The earth was soft under my boots, sometimes almost sucking at the soles when I stepped on muddy patches. At first, the trail seemed clear enough. It was narrow, lined with mossy rocks and thick roots that had broken across it over time, but there was still a faint line where others had once walked. The trees were tall and close together, their branches reaching so high they blocked out most of the sky. The deeper I went, the more muffled everything became. The sound of cars from the distant road faded until it was gone. All I could hear was the soft crunch of my steps and the occasional drip of water falling from a branch. I walked for hours. My plan had been to reach a small ridge I had seen on the satellite view before turning back. It wasn't far, maybe 5 miles in, but because the trail was rough and overgrown, progress was slower than I expected. Vines hung low across the path. Fallen branches blocked sections I had to climb over. At times I lost the faint line completely and had to circle in wide loops before picking it up again. Around midday, the forest changed. The ground sloped upward, and the trees grew thicker. Ferns brushed against my legs as I pushed through. I stopped to drink water, leaning against a damp rock face, and it was then I noticed how quiet everything had become. There weren't even birds. No rustling, no chirping, not even the buzz of insects. Just silence, deep and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The ridge was closer now, maybe only another hour, and I felt the urge to push forward despite the unease that crept into me. I tightened the straps on my pack again and kept going. The climb grew steeper, my calves burned, and sweat ran down my back despite the chill in the air. The soil was loose, sliding under my boots as I pushed upward. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and take in the view. From up there, I could see across the endless green of the forest. It stretched in every direction, rolling hills covered in trees with no signs of roads, houses, or people. Felt both breathtaking and terrifying. The sky had turned gray, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The wind at the ridge was colder, sharper, carrying the faint smell of rain. I pulled out a granola bar and ate while looking around for the trail down the other side. That's when I realized how faint it had become. On the climb up, I had followed a clear enough line, but here the ground was rocky, scattered with leaves, and no path was visible. I walked back and forth, scanning the ridge top, but everything looked the same. The more I searched, the more I began to feel disoriented. Finally, I picked what looked like the most trodden way down. It sloped gradually, and I convinced myself that was the trail. But within minutes, the ground turned into uneven rock faces and thick brush. I had to slide on my hands and knees at times just to get through. My gut told me I had lost it completely. I tried to backtrack, but every direction looked identical. The ridge top was gone, hidden behind trees and rock. I felt my chest tighten as the reality sank in. I was lost. The first thing I did was check my phone. I pulled it from my pocket, but the screen showed no signal. The battery was at 72%. I shoved it back into my pack. I carried a map and compass, but the trail I had taken wasn't even marked on the map, just empty green spaces. All I had was a rough idea of where the road had been when I started. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. I still had water, food, and daylight. I could retrace my steps carefully and make it back. At least that's what I told myself. I picked a direction and began moving, leaving small markers with sticks and rocks so I could tell if I circled back by accident. The forest closed in tighter as I went. Branches snagged at my jacket. Thorns scratched my arms. The ground dipped into gullies and rose into small ridges, breaking my sense of direction. After an hour of steady walking, I stopped and realized something that made my stomach sink. I was standing beside the same moss-covered boulder I had passed earlier. My markers were gone, brushed aside, or maybe I hadn't placed them clearly enough. Either way, I was walking in circles. The sky grew darker as the clouds thickened. A light drizzle began, soaking into my jacket and making the ground slippery. My boots squelched with each step, mud clinging to them in heavy clumps. I decided to stop moving. Continuing blindly was worse than waiting. I found a small clearing surrounded by trees and set my pack down. I ate another granola bar, sipped water, and pulled out my emergency tarp. I rigged it between two trees to keep dry as the rain fell harder. The forest at night was different. Every sound felt amplified. Drops of water hitting leaves, branches creaking under the weight of the rain, the distant crack of something shifting in the darkness. I sat under the tarp, knees pulled to my chest, listening, straining to pick out patterns in the noise. My flashlight beam cut through only a small circle of black, and I turned it off quickly to save power. Sleep came in short bursts, light and uneasy. Every time I dozed off, I woke to some sound. The snap of a twig, the flutter of wings, the distant rustle of something moving. My heart pounded each time, until I forced myself to breathe slowly again. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest was soaked. Mist clung low to the ground, making it hard to see far. I packed up my tarp and started walking again, this time trying to head downhill, thinking the road would eventually be lower than where I was. The ground was treacherous. Slippery rocks and mudslides made me stumble more than once. At one point, I slipped down a short slope and scraped my arm against a sharp rock. Blood trickled down, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from leaves. I wrapped it with a bandage from my first aid kit, but the pain was a constant reminder of how vulnerable I was. Hours passed. My water ran low. My legs felt heavy. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I forced myself to ration the last of my food. Late in the afternoon, I heard something that made me freeze. It wasn't the normal sounds of the forest. It was deliberate, heavy steps, too heavy for deer, too steady for random branches falling. The sound came from behind me, faint but clear. I turned slowly, but the mist made it impossible to see more than 20 feet. The forest stood silent again. I waited, straining to hear, but there was nothing. After a long moment, I turned back and kept moving, faster this time. The sound came again later, footsteps closer, as if keeping distance but following. My chest tightened. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe even another hiker, but deep down I knew. The steps had rhythm. They matched mine. Fear gave me energy. I pushed harder, moving downhill until the light began to fade. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I didn't dare stop. I needed distance. I needed to find something, anything, that proved I wasn't trapped in endless forest. When the sun finally sank, I collapsed near another clearing, too exhausted to keep going. I forced myself to stay alert, but my eyelids grew heavy. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, a branch snapped, then another. I held my breath, heart hammering, but nothing came closer. The night stretched endlessly. Every time I almost drifted off, fear jolted me awake again. The idea of something out there, moving just beyond sight, kept me frozen in place. By morning, I was weak and trembling. My water was gone. My food was gone. I knew if I didn't find a way out soon, I'd collapse for good. Then, in the distance, I heard something new, the faint sound of rushing water. My chest filled with hope. Streams often led to roads or at least landmarks. I forced myself forward, following the sound. The forest thinned, and I stumbled into a rocky gully where a stream rushed over stones. I dropped to my knees, cupped my hands, and drank. The water was cold and sharp, filling me with renewed strength. I followed the stream, pushing through brush, slipping on wet rocks, determined not to lose it. Hours later,